All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jonathan Gautier. I'm with the Georgia Airports Association. Thank you for taking your time out of your day to learn about the 7460 airspace study process. This is our July 2024 webinar. Today we have speakers Alan Hood and Jim Duguay. First up will be Alan Hood. Alan Hood is the Airport Safety Data Program Manager for the Georgia Department of Transportation. He's been with the department for 16 years, both for project management and airport inspection roles. He also spent 4 years with the engineering firm and another 4 years in airport management. He's a graduate of Auburn University in aviation management. He lives in Decatur with his wife, 16-year-old daughter, and 2 dogs and 3 cats. Alan will be presenting on the 7460 process. Alan?
Yes, thank you. Thanks for having me. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right. So what is a 7460? It is a notice of proposed construction or alteration. It's basically you telling the FAA that something is being built or changed on or off the airport. When to file a 7460? Totally depends on the height of the object or structure, proximity to an airport, location, and frequencies emitted from it. There is a very handy notice criteria tool that I will show you later. You don't have to write down that link. It is found in the OEAAA website. Either you can use that function, or in broad general speak, if it is at 100 to 1 for 20,000 feet from a runway 3,200 feet or more, or does it bust a 50 to 1 to a runway shorter than 3,200 feet, or does it bust a 25 to 1 to a heliport for a total distance of 5,000 feet? Or is it any road, railroad, waterway, or other that at the heights at the bottom of that paragraph would bust any of those things? Or does it emit frequencies? Or is it near a navigation facility? Or is it just taller than 200 feet above the ground? Or is it on an airport? Or has the FAA asked you to? These are all the reasons why you need to submit a 7460. They are submitted online at oeaaa.faa.gov. Stands for Obstruction Evaluation, Airport Airspace Analysis. When you get there, there are the option of off airport or on airport. Off airport 7460s are called OEs, stands for Obstacle Evaluations. On airports are called NRAs, non-rulemaking airport. No idea where that came from. Office of Obstruction Evaluation Group handles the off-airport OEs, and the ADOs handle the NRAs. Off-airport 7460s. The FAA cannot say no to any construction or alteration off of an airport. What's going to happen, and if it interrupts a instrument procedure, they'll raise minimums, or even worse, to an airport. The FAA cannot say no. They'll just ding the airport if it does interfere with the airport. Then it falls upon the local governments to stop any construction that may impact an airport. You cannot rely on the FAA to say no to off-airport 7460s. If you're submitting an off-airport, it's really a good idea to try to get what they call a 1A survey to attach to the case. Otherwise, they're going to be adding on 50 feet to a structure in order to evaluate it. Jim will go on to that a little bit more. They say to allow for 45 days for an off-airport 7460, although they're currently experiencing delays and are asking for 60 days for review and determination. For on-airport 7460s, you need to coordinate with GDOT. Either myself or the project manager for that airport should both be copied on the 7460s before you submit them. We'll review them for everything, make sure everything is neat there that is required, because it's a lot harder to change once it's in the system. The cases will not be open for comments unless I tell the FAA to open them. So if I don't know you've submitted them, it's going to take a lot longer for me to find it and ask for it to be opened. This is only on airport. In order to send them to my office and the PM, there's a screenshot you can take of the case details, and also attach any sketches that you'd be attaching to the case in an email to your project manager, and copy myself, or vice versa. Any issues that arise during the review will be corrected in the case before a determination is made. So very rarely will there ever be a determination of hazard made on an airport 7460. We'll correct everything before the determination comes out. Some lessons learned for on-airport 7460s. If you're submitting for any kind of building, a terminal, a T-hangar, any hangar, a minimum of 4 cases. Each corner of the hangar or building gets its own 7460. Fencing. So many cases. It's each turn in the fence, each edge where it impacts a Part 77 approach, or also a threshold sighting approach, also the departure surface, and as well as on center line. There's between 20 and 30 cases get submitted for cases, especially if they cross the approach. You can't combine different work into one 7460. So if you're working on all of the airfield electrical, you submit one runway light, one taxiway light, each PAPI location, a reel. Each individual item gets its own case. If you're doing pavement rehab on a runway and a taxiway, you need both, one runway, one taxiway case. For the most basic project there's a minimum of 3 cases if there's federal money used. You get a permanent case, you need a temporary equipment case, and you need a CSPP case. And that is only if federal money is used. If there's no federal money, you don't need that CSPP case. Construction phasing plan. On airport, nothing can interfere with airport design from 5313B from any approach or departure surface. Also, the ROFA, RSA, nothing can be built in those. And if your temporary equipment is going to interfere with one of those, you got to show the runway closed or displaced during the construction project. They say allow for 45 days. I've seen it a lot more than that. There's 10 different offices that have to answer each case and there's a few that are very low on manpower and take even longer. So I've seen them take up to 120 days. Not ideal, but you got to plan ahead. And if you don't go through us or tell us that you've submitted, it's going to be longer than that before they're opened and going through the system. So I'm going to show you the OE AAA website. We'll go through kind of the steps in submitting a case. Hopefully all the airports know about this site and have used it. They don't solely rely on their consultants to do it, but even if their consultants do submit 7460s for them, I'm going to show you that airports need to use this as well. There's a new function that I just learned about last week that requires the airports to update. So here's the OE AAA website. There's apparently a new version coming out. You can check it out in this link. But until that happens, this is what it looks like. You have down here, there'll be a login or new user registration link here if you haven't already logged in. Well, once you log in, go to your portal page, and you have submitting for an on-airport case, an off-airport case, or many items on the side. This is that notice criteria tool to use if you're off airport, wondering if you should submit a 7460 for something off airport. You choose what it is, you put in the lat longs, the site elevation, the structure height, and it'll spit out if you need to submit a 7460 or not. You can view determined cases, interim, proposed, circularized. You can download a lot of things. It's a very handy website. There's user guides for just about everything. But if you haven't logged in yet, the first thing you need to do once you log in is add a new sponsor. If you're an airport, you fill out the sponsor information for your airport. It can be the airport manager, it can be the sponsor. It doesn't matter. But in order for you to submit a case, you need to add a sponsor. If you're an engineer, you can load up as many sponsors as you have, and you need to make sure you keep those up to date for email addresses and names, because a lot of times the sponsor and the representative who submits both get emailed a copy of the determination letter. And sometimes if you haven't updated your sponsors, it's going to someone who isn't there anymore. So once you add your sponsors, you start a new case. You pick your sponsor up top. Notice of alteration, construction, existing, if it's temporary or permanent, what state it's in, the ident of the airport, name, city, lat long of what you're submitting right here, site elevation, and the structure height in above ground, and site elevation is sea level, above sea level. Your description and remarks of what the case is. Please don't just copy and paste the same paragraph into every case you submit for every different type of facet of the project. You can start with that, but then identify what each case is. The component and development type does not appear on the old PDF that you can still download, but this is new for the online form. You're just telling it what it is. Are you working on a runway, a taxiway, the CSPP? If it's temporary construction equipment, you go to part 77, and then you'll have mobile construction equipment. So on your temporary cases for any kind of ground vehicles, you choose that. If you have to submit for a crane, you'll choose that as well. And that also now needs 4 points in a box out, highlighting the crane operating area. So once you have that filled out, you would print this screen, take a screenshot of it, send it to me and the project manager for GDOT, and send me the sketches you would attach. We'll review it. We'll get back to you. You can have this saved and ready to go. In the next page that comes up after you save it, you need to verify the map location and then add any sketches that you would need. And then once you've done that, then you submit the case and get the case number. So that's submitting a 7460. The new item that I was telling you about is manage airport operations staff. Every airport's going to need to do this now. Apparently it's for FDC NOTAMs. Apparently the commercial service airports have been doing it, and they just added it on for all the general aviation airports too. If I didn't say this before, only general aviation airports need to send GDOT the 7460s before you submit them. Commercial service airports do not. Let's see here. Oh yeah, you can set up subscriptions. If there's off-airport 7460s going on near your airport, you can set up a subscription to get notified of it. Or anytime an off-airport 7460 case gets circularized, you can get notified of it if it's near your airport. So highly suggest all airports get a registration and set up these email notifications, and also manage airport operations staff. Again, user guides just about for everything to use on the website. The only thing they don't highlight right now is that manage operations staff, because it's too new and they haven't updated the user guide yet. That's it for me. I'll turn it over to Jim. Hang on just a second.
Thanks, Alan. Next
Thanks,
up,
Alan.
we have Jim Duguay. Jim Duguay is with Michael Baker. He is the senior aviation, or the associate vice president of aviation planning with Michael Baker, and he'll present on best practices. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, Alan went into a lot of the mechanics of File 7460 and covered a lot of things. Just as a consultant that deals with these on a fairly often basis, I'll just offer some best practices through our experience. Alan mentioned this, but the 7460 on an off-airport analysis is not the determining yes or no that development can happen. Only you as a sponsor can prevent new hazards, and you have to have tools, land use authority tools to do that. That could be an overlay district, that could be easements, that could be zoning. But there's a lot of misconceptions that, especially with the city planners that may not work for the airport, that all they need to do is get a 7460 back and then they're good. And a lot of times these off-airport developments are pretty far along when it finally reaches the airport that so-and-so wants to build a 20-story building off the end of your approach. And, the architect's out of budget, and the last thing he wants to hear is he has to lower his building 20 feet. So overlay districts and easements are the best tools for that. The notice to criteria tool Alan mentioned is very useful, and it doesn't tell you what the airspace impacts are. It just tells you whether or not you need to file, and highly encourage the use of that. It's not foolproof. There's definitely, you can make one typo on a number and it's going to put you far away from the airport, and somebody could get confused and think that they don't need to file. Part 77 is the presumed hazard. It's always presumed hazard if you're penetrating Part 77. That should protect you for most off-airport cases, although penetration Part 77 can definitely be allowed. Your airport consultant, or if you have airport staff available, can help look at these issues for off-airport developments and provide an opinion of whether or not the development, if it penetrates Part 77, if it may just need to be lit or remain below one of the critical services, the obstacle clearance services. You can also put your consultant in touch with the contractors and architects, and so might be able to work with them to give them an idea of what's going to be doable on the property. And then every time you file 7460, it's set in stone, whatever you put in there. So if you make a mistake or the contractor changes something, the clock gets started over and over again. That's something that you never want to hear. But when we look at potential developments off airport, there is the Part 77 surface, which is, in this example, the solid line, 34-to-1 slope. But as you may know, the critical surfaces are the threshold siting criteria, also called obstacle clearance surfaces. And quite often that's not as demanding of a slope as Part 77. So if you send this to your engineer or look at it in-house, you want to consider whether or not there's OCS penetrations if you're willing to work with that off-airport development. Keep in mind you have this example here shows the addition of height to roadways. Just regular roadways need 15 feet of height. Interstates, I think it's 17. Railroads 23. Sometimes we forget to put those into the 7460. Another thing that I've noticed on 7460s is that the FAA doesn't always have your full build out shown on your ALP. They don't always consider the impacts to that. They may not have your full runway length in there that's shown on your ALP. They may not be aware or have made notes to look at improved approaches. So, for example, if you're converting a GPS approach from non-precision horizontally guided to a vertically guided GPS, the slope is going to get lower. And in a lot of cases, the FAA is only going to evaluate what your current approaches are. Another issue see fairly often is that the local zoning was probably created using the FAA's model zoning ordinance in probably back in the 1960s when the airport first received grants from the FAA. And a lot of times there's been a significant development at the airport and those zoning ordinances are way out of date. They'll probably reference clear zones, which are now RPZs. A lot of times the easements that were acquired by the airport back in the 60s or whenever are the old 20-to-1 slopes, and the airport needs to protect for 34-to-1 slopes now. So it's important to investigate that when you're looking into especially off-airport issues. And then also keep in mind, I think the FAA's gotten better at this, but they do routinely go to an airport and say, well, we can do a better approach on this runway end. And they don't always, at least historically, have not always thought, well, what is that going to do to the RPZ size or the approach slope size? And they end up creating reverse impacts on the airport somewhat unknowingly. I will defend the FAA. They say that they're getting better at this. Alan mentioned the accuracy codes, and it's very important when you submit, especially off-airport, you certify to an accuracy code, which kind of doesn't make sense if the thing hasn't been built yet. But quite often we'll get a surveyor to at least certify the ground, the exact point where the structure will be built on the ground, and write a certification statement of that accuracy. The default accuracy you see here is 4D, which is plus 50 feet vertical. So that would have a huge impact on a proposed building just outside of the airport on the instrument approach procedures. And we'll often get off-airport architects call us up and say, how can we get this approved? And that's the first thing we'll look for is the accuracy code that was applied. And, tell them, well, if you just resubmit with the correct accuracy code, all these impacts are going to go away. One final thing is don't be afraid to appeal a 7460. I've had some where, for example, over by the Braves Stadium, there was a high-rise being built, and the 7460 came back and said that it was going to block Dobbin's radar, their radar sweep along the horizon there. And all it did was we requested an appeal, or they recircularized it. And apparently some of these things, they just get flagged on the first review by the FAA. But when you push back, then they actually ask the person who runs the radar, is this going to be a problem or not? And in that case, it turned out it was not. There was already buildings in the area shielding that radar to begin with. So the proposal was approved. With that, I think we're about to get into Q&A. I did want to show one example. Still got it up here. of how to file the notice criteria tool. And if this is not on the screen, please let me know. But let's say I'm going to use Gwinnett County Airport as a guinea pig, but let's say you've got a proposed building off the end of the runway and you want to do a quick evaluation to tell them whether or not you think that this is a good idea or not. So Google Earth is really good, is really useful at this. You can find that approximate point on the map, right click on Google Earth. And well, it's not letting me do it, but add a this little thumbtack to add a place mark where that building is. And using that, you can figure out what the lat long is of the proposed development. You can go into the notice criteria tool, and I didn't put this in earlier, so it already has the data in there, but put the lat long in there. And to figure out the ground height, this is not totally survey quality, but Google Earth will tell you what the ground elevation is. If you look on the far right screen, it says 1083 feet. It's right down here. And that elevation moves around based on where you are. So that's just a rough estimate of what the elevation is there. So I've got that punched in here with a 50-foot building. You hit submit. And here's the results. Your proposal exceeds the instrument approach area by 81 feet. Aeronautical studies are required to determine it, and it shows you a little crude figure of where it's hitting the criteria tool. Now, this little diagram is not the actual airspace. It's just the dimensions of what triggers required 7460. But again, this is a useful tool if you input everything right to help with 7460s. With that, I think we'll open it up to Q&A.
Thanks, Jim. I got one question. Might be good for Alan. How many airport operations staff should you have at your airport? What if you have two airports? Should they be the same for each? Are those people?
That is a great question because I just learned about this last week. I would say put in however many people you have. And if you have multiple airports, put them in for both airports. Again, it's apparently for FTC NOTAM, and I don't know if there's also a new function that you can request the NOTAMs in the OE AAA. I don't know how all that works because it's brand new. So I think they only allow the people that are on that operations staff list to be able to submit or ask to remove the NOTAMs. And I think the determination letters now say that, but I did notice in one case recently where you have the option for canceling or asking for the NOTAMs. And I think they only allow the people that do that are listed on that operations staff list. Again, I wish I knew more about it. It's brand new. I haven't used it in order to tell everybody how to use it.
Thanks, Alan. Anybody else with any comments, questions?
Yeah, can you explain when you receive the emails on different obstructions, under status? I think everyone knows what determined means because you get a determination letter. But work in progress and interim, what defines those two?
I believe work in progress is it's open for comments. Before that, it probably hasn't even been. If it's something other than work in progress, I don't think it's even been open for comments yet. I think it's just sitting in the system waiting on someone to open it for comments.
Can you elaborate a little more on the CSPP cases?
If there's federal money in the project on airport, the FAA wants to know how you are. All construction projects have a safety phasing plan. They basically want that submitted, and it shows, where the stuff is on the airport, how, what's closed, barricades, X's, where they are, your haul routes and everything shown on that. Jim, can you elaborate any more on the making, on what goes into a CSPP?
Only in that, yeah, it's a complicated document that shows, fencing and haul routes, things like that. So it makes sense it gets submitted 7460. Yeah, and then there's always a question is, it's just a regular project, do you submit it? And from what we've learned, there's no federal money, you don't need to, which I don't really know why there's a difference there.
If it's complicated, we'll ask for it, but if there's no federal money, it's not a requirement.
All right, great. Any more questions? For construction cases, how many would you do and what elevation height?
Depends what you're constructing. Pavement's going to be, the structure height is 1 foot. You can't do anything less than that. It just depends on how complicated the project is.
Yeah, Alan, would that be say a paver? If a paver was doing a mill and overlay, and they would be moving not just on the runway but on a haul route as well. Well, how do you kind of choose your limits for that? Do you do like the closest to the runway? What's your recommendation?
Yep, always closest point to the runway. We have had recently an airport that had a haul route all around the airport around 2 runway ends, and the FAA came back and asked for a couple additional points on the haul route, especially because there was a VOR on the field, and they wanted to make sure that that haul route wasn't going to interfere with that. So, in the standard project, if you're not going to be closing the runway, they need to know the closest point the equipment's going to get to that runway. If you are closing the runway, the temporary equipment case is just going to be the staging area, because the airport's closed for a 1 runway airport. The airport's closed if it's, if you're closing the runway, they don't care if their equipment's on the runway. They just want to know where it's going to be while the runway's open. If it's a multiple runway airport, then, closest point to the open runway.
Got it, thanks.
Somebody says, anyone try to clone a case lately without a project in the last week? I'm getting an error screen when I do. Is cloning the right way to add a crane to a project?
If you're adding a crane and you haven't done one yet, no, I would start a whole new case. Cloning, I haven't done that. I know if you're doing like a building in the system, you can add additional points in this, and it'll turn into separate cases. But I cannot speak to cloning. But if you're adding a crane to a whole project that you don't have one yet, start a whole new case over. Sorry, maybe someone who has tried some of the other things that I haven't can explain any better.
All right. Well, thank you, Jim. Thank you, Alan. Hopefully, this was a very informative conversation on 7460s.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks
you.
for having us.
Appreciate the opportunity.
Mm-hmm.